The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 23rd chapter. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he's done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us!" This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" A third time he said, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and the hills cover us. For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? 2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Don't you fear God, since you're under the same sentence of condemnation? And we, indeed, have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." At this time, I invite you to stand as you are comfortable. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in 2. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. This is my first time doing this here, so I may have left some things out of the bulletin. Good morning again.
Good morning.
I always like to explain what we've just done when we do that. I think that's kind of important because it's so weird. We start as Palm Sunday, and I think that we often wish it would stay Palm Sunday the whole day. And that's a perfectly fair reaction. We like the story of the triumphant entry into Jerusalem. It's a great story. It comes with the parade, joyful praises, people waving palm branches. Okay, so technically Luke does not mention the palms, but you have to have palms or else it would be people laying their cloaks on the road Sunday, and that's not the same. It's a great story. It's happy. It's fun. But if we stayed with the happy palm branches and we forgot about the cross, we'd be fooling ourselves. If we stopped the story with Jesus as the happy, conquering king apparent, worse, we'd be telling a different story. Because the cross is always there. It's always been there. Even when we were kids and didn't really understand the whole concept of foreshadowing. Even when we just read the Palm Sunday Gospel and don't read the whole part with the crucifixion, it's always there. The cross is always there. Death is always there. Jesus comes into town riding on a colt. Okay, so it's not a mighty war horse, excuse me. Nobody's fooled, though. They can see the crowds. It's not the size of the horse that worries people, it's the size of the crowd. Why do you think the Pharisees tell Jesus to get his disciples to be quiet? It's not because they're horrible, boring, no fun. It's because they can see what's coming. If you ride into town with crowds cheering your arrival, you had better either A, be the king, or else B, be prepared to make yourself the king fast. Because the people in charge are going to notice, and they're not going to like what they see, and they're going to try to stop it. And since they have all the forces of imperial Rome behind them, they are probably going to stop it. In other words, if you start acting like the king, you are liable to end up dead. It's not a plot twist. It's not even dramatic irony. It's just cause and effect. Peace in heaven, ha ha. More like big trouble on earth. So we can either read the whole crucifixion part or not, but we're going to get to the cross either way. Good Friday, the day when Jesus dies, is coming. The cross is coming. Death is coming. We don't get to pretend we don't know. That's not the way the story goes. Jesus isn't that kind of king. But although Jesus is not the kind of king we think that we want, he is the king. He's the king who shows his glory not from a beautiful throne, but from a wretched cross. He's the king who walks that path that leads to that cross for our sake, and for the sake of all who would shout crucify if we were given half a chance. Jesus shows forth God's glory and strength and power, not by commanding the stones to cry out, but by suffering and dying in weakness and shame. And even as he is mocked and derided and challenged to save himself, he will die to save the whole world. He will die to save me and you and all of us. For this morning, then, and for this whole Holy Week, we remember the long and painful journey that leads always to the cross. We remember what Jesus suffered for our sake. We watch and wait and listen. But just as we don't get to pretend that we don't know about Good Friday, we also know that Easter is coming. The empty tomb is coming. Our risen Lord and Savior is coming. New life is coming. Jesus is coming. So in his name, all God's people say, Amen.